And that's quite deliberate, and we'll get into that a little bit later. So it's my spelling of Biripai. So we'll get into that a little bit later. But for those of you that don't know me, I'll just briefly mention some other aspects of my background. And I'm fairly unique. I'm a Birpai traditional owner, but I'm also a descendant of a white convict, an English convict. So I'm Goories and convict descent. So I bring an interesting perspective to the discussion table, certainly today anyway. But my convict ancestry wasn't at Port Macquarie, even though, as mentioned earlier, the confusion around some of the written records, some of the, the baptisms, and in fact the marriage of my convict ancestor and my Goorie ancestor are recorded as Port Macquarie. But that was because the priest that married them, a minister, Purvis, was the Presbyterian minister here at Port Macquarie. And the reason why, and he travelled, he was an itinerant minister, and they were living on Charlotte's country, which is southern Biripai country, near Gloucester. And he travelled down there as part of his circuit. But the reason why he performed the ceremony of their marriage and the baptism of some of the kids was that the Church of England refused to recognise that a black woman could take a vow of marriage in their church. So Bishop Broughton refused to marry them. But the Presbyterians came good, so and then informal discussion had a little bit earlier with one of our members here was that divide that exists and perhaps still exists, certainly existed in my youth between the Catholics and Protestants in Australia. It's just one of the many divides, and certainly our history here is basically a history of division. And most of the discussion today has centred around the non-Indigenous aspects of the history the history during the last 200 years of this part of the world, Biripai country. But in those presentations, there was mention of Indigenous peoples, but as I commented to someone else, it's almost as if we're just extras in a movie set, you know, so we get a mention, but there's no kind of in-depth study. And some of the published histories of Port Macquarie have made reference to Indigenous or Biripai people, but most normally it's only been a small section of the work. Yet we've been here for hundreds of thousands of years, perhaps. And 200 years is what this these events of this week, which some people still want to call a celebration. And I've got real problems with that. I can't see how we can celebrate the commencement of the invasion of Biripai lands. But anyway, and I think the council itself here in Port Macquarie has made an effort to be more inclusive of our peoples, and certainly on their programs. And in some of the promotional materials that I've seen, that they've made reference to the Bicentennial events. However, some people like to grasp on the idea that it's a celebration, and it can't be a celebration for our peoples. And my talk, although it will only be a broad one, will touch on some of those things. We'll provide a Biripai perspective of the history. And it is a Biripai, it's mine as a Biripai man, as a Biripai traditional knowledge holder. And I don't pretend to speak on behalf of all of our peoples. You know, I wouldn't even dare speak on behalf of my own immediate family. You know, each of us have our own opinions and our own thoughts and beliefs, and should be entitled to those. So my talk hopefully is about moving forward. And I think that how we move forward effectively is to respect others and respect others' opinions. And that is part of our dreaming. It's part of our being as Goories people, as Biripai people. And the slide that I commenced with, I deliberately have got that there because it's there in black and white. And too often we look at the history, not only of Biripai history over the last 200 years, but the whole history of this continent is often looked or viewed purely and simply through that black and white lens or paradigm. And it's more complex than that. It's more detailed, and I hope that I can bring some of that out. But the image there is a brilliant image, and it was taken by a white photographer, one of the leading citizens of Port Macquarie during the first couple of decades of the 20th century. Thomas Dick is the photographer's name. And my own immediate family were some of his subjects and collaborators in that project. So that's why I've published what I have on them after doing some research to tell something of their stories, because Thomas Dick only set out to present images of Biripai people as observed by early explorers such as John Oxley. So he was only interested in providing the image of the noble savage, if you like. And Thomas Dick was more than that. He was more than just a great photographer. And he was using that kind of cameras that had this tripod set up like we've got in the front here. So he put over his head and glass plate negatives, and our people would have to hold a pose there for a minute or so while he did. And so when you look at some of the images, they did an incredible job. But that particular image was taken out at Grant's Head near Bonny Hills, part of Bonny Hills. And in the background is North Brother Man or Durgan, and that's an essential part of our story as well. But that particular image also is showing three of our men, two of them that I have identified, Charlie Murray and Peter Punch. So the three of them are looking out to sea and observing perhaps Captain Cook or Lieutenant Cook, as he was there, going up the coast. And Thomas had another image. Thomas Dick had another image where he actually drew the Endeavour in on the horizon for that glass plate negative. But intriguing man and interesting man, and I'm privileged to be here today to talk about the history of Port Macquarie, because 100 years ago, Thomas Dick was writing a weekly article in the local paper with the title of Old Port Macquarie Fragments of Her History, or Our History. And so he was a historian. He's one of the earliest published historians in Port Macquarie, and it's great that our numbers have grown since then, and will continue to grow. But it wasn't all black and white, and as we see from this next slide, certainly prior to 1770 or 1788, our country, the continent, was a very colourful place. It was full of black fellas, but we're colourful people. Yeah, some of the great extracts that I've quoted from observant white commentators noted that we were friendly people. and with a disposition towards laughter rather than tears. They made note that we were great mimics. And even the kids took on characteristics of white people that they observed. And so that would become part of the storytelling, you know. This one's walking this way, or, you know. And so we're colourful people. It's a colourful nation, continent. You notice there wasn't much white there in that picture there, was it? But sadly, things changed. The continent then became very white, and largely has maintained that to today, even though, as mentioned before, in the first penal colony here in Port Macquarie, there were people other than white Anglo-Saxons, particularly amongst the convicts, and you know, at least one of them was highlighted. But there were many other nations, nationalities, pardon me, that was involved. And in my own family's history, and I look at transgenerational stories, there's certainly links to Chinese, and Chinese people, interestingly, that were brought out to Australia, this particular group, by the Australian Agricultural Company, to which my convict ancestor was assigned. And they were brought out as cheap labour. So as I said earlier, you know, the more things change, the more things stay the same. Yeah. So you'll notice that Biripai there is spelled different again. And Tamsin was a little bit worried that she might pronounce Biripai the wrong way, or even write it the wrong way. And to be quite honest, I think I've seen about 7 different spellings of the word. And it's challenging. Some people suggest that they're experts. I don't. I'm not a linguist. I only pronounce words the way that I learnt them. And I've always felt that language really is a method of communication. So as long as you're able to communicate to whomever you're wishing to communicate, it doesn't matter if your pronunciation isn't spot on. I had a couple of old uncles, you know, they would always pronounce apple as happle. So they put an H in there. But when it come to a hat, it'd be an at. And that was because we had no H in any of our Goories alphabets. All right? It's a sound that we didn't have. But the problem was, or is, still is, that people that have tried to write down Goorie languages are using the English alphabet to do so. And there aren't similar sounds. There's a lot of sounds. Just even the word Birpai, can be pronounced more softly as Birpai. So it's a P instead of a B in that sense. It doesn't mean you're wrong. You'll notice that I say Goorie. A lot of people say Kuri. Okay? So it's the same word. I think we spend too much time debating the wrong things. So I deliberately used that slide there to show that, well, we were still a colourful nation, even though we was in a newly formed environment. Yeah, and that pre-white settlement environment, when I've described it to some people, they said, well, you're talking about utopia. And I said, well, it might well be utopia. I mean, I think it's utopia because we had no convicts, we had no jails, We had no armies. We had no wars. We had no poverty. We're there. And we're still trying to locate young Michael there, got me looking. Where that one, to determine where that particular photo was taken with those macrozamians. But they're just two of the type plants. And as I've said, it's often referred to as a utopia. It was certainly a land of plenty. And it was, some people would say, a land of milk and honey. And like I said, some of my old uncles would always say, well, there was a land of milk and honey long before the white man brought the cows and the European booze. All right? Because we kind of had everything. So what happened? Well, what happened was this old fellow, well, he's a young fellow then, called John Oxley, decided to get lost trying to locate the, well, basically a source of an inland sea. But he found his way across Biripai country, trespassed across Biripai country, as he had trespassed across the other nations leading him. In 1818, he may not have been the first English or others or from other nations to actually set foot. Well, he certainly wasn't the first. Let me be clear on it. He certainly wasn't the first that set foot on Biripai country, our northern Biripai country. Reference was made a little bit earlier to William, or to Mary Bryant, in fact, but the William and Mary Bryant expedition, where they successfully reached Timor in 1791. There's some debate over whether their second stop was Port Macquarie. The wider thinking is it was Port Stephens, although there is a publication that suggests it was Port Macquarie. And I believe that Port Macquarie is more likely the case because it's generally believed that they reached Glenrock Lagoon, just south of Newcastle, after the first 2 days' travel in the cutter that they'd stolen from Governor Phillip. Now, the next stage of their trip was 2 days, and a good mariner with the cutter and having already travelled the number of nautical miles that they had to get to Glenrock Lagoon would have got to Port Macquarie in those 2 days. And if that's correct, then we've got an official record of hostilities because our Birpai people challenged them and they didn't understand Birpai culture. And so their only response was to fire the musket that they had. So they retaliated in a way which wasn't expected by our peoples. But apart from the Bryants, in the intervening period between them and John Oxley, there was also the wreckage of the brig called the Trial at what just north of here is now known as Trial Bay. And a number of the people involved there escaped. And one of them, I can't think of the name at the moment, she lived for a number of years with our mob there, or whether they were Biripai or Dungulli people. Doesn't matter, they were always in contact with each other. And she lived there and had a couple of kids. So it was well known that the European people before John Oxley came. Finally, Clive misread my hand signal. But that image of John Oxley's expedition, again, was a staged image by Thomas Dick, and it was to commemorate the 100th anniversary of Oxley's trek through Port Macquarie. So, you know, it's become it's a good historical record, but it's, he juxtaposed, actually another one of my old uncles, Clary Dungy, Clary Dungy, here with Uncle Charlie Murray as part of the Oxley expedition. But I don't think from his journals that I've been able to determine that he had any Goories travelling with him. Should have, he would have saved himself a bit of trouble. Yeah, thanks. But certainly the first major impact of Europeans on Biripai country was the commencement of the penal colony, or the penal settlement. And it began 200 years ago from next week, the 17th of April. And this image shows the kind of a military that was observed by our people at the time. I think that particular uniform, although I don't think that they changed much, Clive would know better than me, that was His Majesty's 48th Regiment. And I think that we kind of gloss over that a little bit too much. They were troops of His Majesty. They were British troops. The penal colony was basically under military rule to a large extent. Capital punishment could not be carried out by the commandants. That was one of the issues that had to be resolved in Sydney. But other than that, it was the rule of the military. But apart from the soldiers that accompanied Allman, were 3 Goories from Newcastle. Biripai is the one that I've got the picture of, and that picture drawn was made of him 20 years later, or 18, 19 years later. Biripai's story is an incredible story, and it's an ongoing one with Biripai people. And there was earlier mentioned that Bob Barrett was another one of the Goories that came from Newcastle. And the third one was a fellow who had the Goorie name of Wirrikutter. And Wirrikutter is an Awabakal word, which is part of the same language group as Biripai. So a lot of words, not that I know, okay, but a lot of words that I know through both Biripai pronunciation and Awabakal pronunciation, and there are slight differences. And we'll come to one later. But Biripai was interesting because Biripai spoke English better than most of the Englishmen. He had been brought up in Sydney as a servant, basically, to an officer named John McGill. And John McGill gave him that English name of McGill. So when John McGill returned to England, as fate would have it for us all, he gave young Biripai, in his late teens at this stage, to Captain Allman. So when Allman came here, he brought his faithful black servant. He brought Biripai with him. But Biripai only stayed here in Port Macquarie as long as Allman did. So when Allman left Port Macquarie and was posted to Newcastle, Biripai returned to Newcastle with him. And within 2 years, Biripai teamed up with the Reverend Lancelot Threlkeld, who was part of the London Missionary Society. And Threlkeld, a lot of linguists still debate this, but I argue, as a non-linguist, Threlkeld's contribution to the recording of Goori language is one of the greatest, and certainly of its time. And what Threlkeld made note of was that a lot of the sounds that are part of Goori language, aren't in English, but are more closely resembled to some of the sounds of language on the continent. And you hear that when you hear Dutch speakers or German speakers or whatever. I can hear those sounds are more closer to our traditional sounds. And so Threlkeld knew that. And he wrote down words painstakingly. He wrote down sentences. And he did it because he had Biripai as his chief informant. And he made it clear that Biripai would continually correct him until he got it right. So Threlkeld's work on language is incredible, but that part of the story comes back later because Threlkeld, due to his expertise with Goori language, particularly from the Sydney or the Hawkesbury up to just north of here, appeared at a number of court trials for Goori people as part of the defence team. They weren't allowed to swear an oath. They weren't able to defend themselves. So he took it on himself, working with Biripai to represent people. And he didn't come up here, but he was involved with here on the trial of Wombati in 1837, which I mentioned earlier. Wombati was released, and eventually Taramiji was charged with the same offence and then hung here. So Allman arrived with the 3 Albuquerque Goories as trackers. They had all worked on the Newcastle penal colony in assisting to track down and bring back escaped convicts. So that was part of the plan. But obviously another aspect of the plan was to have them as a go-between between the white fellas that knew nothing about Birpai language and the locals, even though it's not mentioned in Allman's notes. 30-odd pages of rules and regulations for establishing the colony here, not one mention of blackfellas. We disappeared from the ether, apparently. And in subsequent writings of the history, we certainly disappeared from the ether. And this myth of a peaceful settlement developed and it's continued. It was partly peaceful because it operated under a proclamation, I guess, that Governor Macquarie had made in 1816, which forbade any armed Aboriginal to be within 1 mile of any white settlement. Now, they made no distinction between a hunting boomerang, a killer boomerang, a returning boomerang, a fish and spear, or an animal hunting spear, or a bundi, a club, or whatever. They just assumed that all of these utensils were weapons. So none of our people were going to get within 1 mile of this peaceful settlement with any arms. And if they wanted to give up carrying any arms into this barricaded settlement full of soldiers with muskets, then they could do it as long as there was no more 6 of them loitering at any one time. So we were loiterers on that one. Too animated here. Might have been one of my old people telling me I'm talking too much.
Pop it down there.
Wouldn't be the first time, would it? Yeah, so that led to part of the commencement of this myth of peaceful settlement. But I ask people to consider these concepts when they think about a peaceful settlement. Think about the concept of invasion and tell me it didn't happen here or anywhere else in Australia. Subjugation, the concept of occupied territory. The understanding of the concept of sovereignty. Later on, we'll look at the other two that I've referenced there, treaty and Makarrata, because I think that's part of the way forward. So it was a complex coexistence, if you like, between the white penal colony and Birpai people. As I mentioned, Macquarie's proclamation limited some of the interaction, but other aspects of the interaction were almost totally related to Biripai dreaming, our belief system, our way of being. And part of that was our movement seasonally throughout our territories. So we were never camped here at Port Macquarie, this location, for more than a couple of weeks at a time. Okay? And that makes sense. You know, once you start camping, you've got to worry about sanitation and so on and so forth. You've got to worry about permanent food sources and so on and so forth. We had developed a complex system over 100,000 years perhaps that enable us to work with our environment, an environment that we held dear to us, that we felt that we're just a part of in the same way as every plant, every insect, every drop of breath that we breathe, the stars in the sky. It's all part of our being. So we learned to live, we developed complex society to live within that framework. Or part of that knowledge system enabled this foothold of a penal colony to be established in a limited confined space. Now, the penal colony initially was only around the waterfront area, you know, basically just in town there from Coolumbung Creek back up to, towards Flagstaff Hill, basically. And the only extensions of that initially was on the other side of Coolumbung Creek at Settlement Point, where the first settlement farm, and then within before Roland died. So within the first 4 years, the commencement of a satellite settlement, in some sense, if you like, at Roland's Plains. And it was mentioned earlier, I think at one stage there, it was mentioned that at one stage there was about 1,500 convicts at Port Macquarie, but I think it was about 300 or 400, at least 300 of them were stationed at Roland's Plains. So we become a major centre. Apart from those physical locations of those large numbers, the only intrusions beyond those areas were convicts were sent out to gather cedar and so on and so forth. And that led, in fact, to the first open hostility within the first few months of the so-called peaceful settlement, when 2 convicts were speared near where Warhope is today. And that episode is a really interesting one, because the night before they were speared, they were sitting around the fire with these blackfellas. They were having a cup of tea, they were sharing food and everything. Hospitality was fine. Next day, 2 of them were speared. This reinforced the thinking within white society that Oxley had laid down a few years before, and that was that blackfellas couldn't be trusted, that we were treacherous people. And in fact, one of the encounters that Oxley had was down there, just north of the Mile Lakes entrance on the coast, at what is still known as Treachery Point and Treachery Beach. And he named them such because the night before, his party was joined by something like 80 blackfellas. He noted for the first time men, women and children. When he trespassed our country up north here, northern Birpai country, our men shielded the women and children. He made no contact whatever with women and children. Down there he did. But because they had a cordial evening prior and then were spared the following day, he said, well, they were treacherous people. He also noted in his journal that amongst that group were a number that spoke English. So they were quite familiar with non-Indigenous peoples, mainly through the military outposts that had been established at Port Stephens, at what's now known as Soldiers Point, but also through the penal colony at Newcastle. So they could communicate with him in his language. Now, I argue that they probably directed him to take such and such a path. And he didn't. He veered off course. They'd gone to a place where they shouldn't have gone. Might have been a sacred women's site. Might have been sacred men's site. They got speared. They weren't wiped out. They moved on. All was forgiven as far as we were concerned. They got out of where they were headed. But led him to think an old blackfellas could not be trusted. And from that point on, he made that claim. The treachery was never far away. But through Biripai eyes, I'm thinking our people thought the same thing. We've sat down with him, we've shared bread with him. We've told him which way to go. He's probably assured us that, yeah, we'll go that way. And what does he do? He veers off course. And white fellas can't be trusted. They're treacherous bastards, aren't they? But there was, apart from the hostilities, there was that mutual cooperation. And within the first couple of months of the establishment of the penal colony, some local Goories were identified and involved in tracking down escaped convicts. And two of them that I've mentioned there, Munungo was awarded a brass breastplate for his services. Again, something that Governor Macquarie had introduced. And interestingly, one of the slides earlier showed Bungary. And Bungary actually came to Port Macquarie as well. He came to Port Macquarie after the Oxley expedition, but between that expedition and when Allman came, Allman was involved with Philip Parker King, as well as John Oxley, in doing 2 separate surveys of the area to help determine its suitability as a convict settlement. And on at least one of those surveys was Bungary. And Bungary was a noted navigator. And by that time, 16 years earlier, he had circumnavigated Australia with Matthew Flinders. So Moonangal, and he was noted as the chief of the Port Macquarie Blacks. That was on there. But Yarrabee is another one of our local men that was recognised in the same way. And his recognition was chief of the Camden Haven Blacks. So his clan was identified as being quite separate to Moonangal's. And how the Camden Haven come on board, it was mentioned earlier, when they're building the cathedral and they were using oyster shells, they were actually using, if not totally, they were certainly partly using, as part of that process, the shells that they were getting from our midden sites, the sites that were where our people over centuries had left discarded shells after eating them. And I know one midden site where the scientists have identified 27 different species of shellfish. So that shows you the extent of our land of plenty. And some of the middens, I mean, there was an extensive one along what's now Lighthouse Beach, but this initial one that they were getting from around the Camden Haven. But there's an incredible midden that still exists up at Clyde Bucket, which goes for kilometres. So it shows you just how many people ate over a long period of time. And Munban was another local Goorie that was involved in, he was involved in 2 of the rescues of convicts who would have drowned in the harbour because of the difficult conditions at the time. The whitefellas were too frightened to jump in to save them. Or couldn't save themselves, them other ones. And the silly blackfellas would jump in, oh, we'll help out, yeah. We'll get a medal. Yeah. So while we as peoples were happy to coexist, we were actually subjugated. We had our laws ignored, and we were subject to the non-Indigenous laws. And that led to a couple of court cases. One of them in 1824, I think it was quite early on, where the Goorie, whose name was, the English name of Foley, he was acquitted from his trial in Sydney because they got the wrong Foley. You know what it's like doing research and you get the same name but you get the wrong person. So they had problems then too. And by 1830, we had our first outbreak of smallpox here. Again, attributed to a convict, but in this case, it was attributed to a convict who had escaped and reached Port Macquarie from Moreton Bay. But it led to the death of a great number of Goories. I forget who the commandant was at the time, but he moved most of the Goories that were infected over onto the North Shore so that they were trying to keep them away from everyone else. And of course, we had no resistance. That's a great number of the Goories died, and one of them was Bob Barrett's wife. you know, so she was an old woman that never made it back home. So the subjugation and everything else existed because of this belief that somehow blackfellas just disappear into the ether. You know, it intrigues me that people can even think that, you know, to think that we were all sitting and waiting on campfires at the foreshore for these ghost-like people to arrive. We say, look, we've been looking after this place for 100,000 years, you know, sick of it. You come and take over. We're out of here. And that's how it appeared. That's how it appeared in the mentality of non-Indigenous people. In general, not all of them, of course, but in general, there was a belief blackfellas got no right to this country because they didn't put fences up like we do. They don't farm like us, blah, blah, blah. So they don't basically exist. So as long as we can live our life the way that we want to, and they don't interfere, then so be it. So this lie of terra nullius continued. And it actually began with James Cook, Lieutenant James Cook, because Cook's instructions from the Admiralty was that if he was to come across populated countries, he was to enter into negotiations with those peoples in the form of treaties to enable, by international or even at that time, a proper justification in their terms of what they intended to do there. But Cook ignored that, and he claimed Australia as if it was an uninhabited land. But we were here, and we were set aside though. So the more and more white society encroached on Biripai land, the more we were forced into enclosed spaces. And that particularly increased after the abandonment of the penal colony and leading up to its total abandonment during the 1830s. And during that period of time, you had land being opened up to so-called free selection, and you had non-Indigenous people who were given convicts, as was mentioned earlier, to work for them. And it was all done to save money for the British, the Crown. It was cheaper to have someone else look after the convicts than to keep them in jail. So part of our being pushed aside, we were set up on so-called black camps. So a major one that I got close connection to, because my grandmother were born on the so-called black camp at Rollins Plains. All right. So there were a number of them, but changes in attitude by colonial government led to a process of setting up land specially reserved for the use of Aborigines. And that commenced after, again, one of those commissions, but in the 1840s. And, but we didn't have any special reserves set up here until the 1880s. And one of them was at Rollins Plains. But where our people were surviving, whether it was on reserves or working on the new white property owners' property, or whether that it was in blacks' camp. When the Education Act came into being in the early 1870s, which said that all children in the colony in New South Wales by then were entitled to attend school, our people kind of jumped on board and saw it as a way to continue to coexist, but on more equal terms. which led to non-Indigenous people taking up petitions to have our kids excluded. And there's some incredible petitions from this area here. Yeah, they're very sad to read. And it led to the establishment of so-called part-time black schools. So my grandmother and her siblings, they attended for some time, they attended a part-time black school at Rollins Plains. But when they moved to around Warhope, they attended the part-time black school at Warhope. They were part-time because they had the same teacher. Teacher used to work 2 days a week at Rollins Plains, ride his bike down to Warhope and teach the last 2 days of the school week there. So white kids, and we talk about equal opportunity, white kids had the opportunity of 5 days schooling. Goorie kids had 2 days. I wonder why we didn't do so well, eh? That solves that problem as to why it took me till I'm 70 to get a PhD. Long time. But part of the process was the process of assimilation. And that was forcing Aboriginal people to become like whites. And it was a designated process. And it also led to the breaking up of town camps. And again, my immediate family was involved. Ours was the last family that was moved off the town reserve here in Port Macquarie in 1910. We were the last black family that were forcibly moved there because, and there was only about 1,000 non-Indigenous people in the whole area at the time, but they didn't want black fellas too close to town. You know? So they were forcibly removed. And then you had changes to, or our ways were put under control of the Aboriginal so-called Protection Board, which later became the Aboriginal Welfare Board. But they were forcing people from the town camps onto what they now controlled, or they controlled Aboriginal reserves. And once they got our families on there, they were able to remove the kids. And by then, they had established in around 1910 the Kinchura Boys' Home over at Kempsey and Cootamundra Girls' Home. And our families, a number of Biripai people were taken away through them. And we talk about transgenerational heritage of whatever, or this transgenerational impact of those stolen generations has only just become recognised over the last 15, 20 years. But there had been positive changes around us, and some of them because we as people, while we were beginning to be assimilated, we're still trying to maintain aspects of our culture and our beliefs. So still trying to maintain family and connection to country and so on. And so not all Goories sat idly by, and those that had skills with English literate skills began to publish their own letters and write challenges over what was happening to them and them. And one of the Biripai people, and I mentioned some of the earlier people, but one of the most prominent Biripai people was an old fellow from Rollins Plains, from the Davis family at Rollins Plains, and a number of them were very active in, for example, getting the government to reopen black schools that they kept closing down because of changing enrolments. And so they were in turn petitioning the government to enable Goorie kids to have the opportunity. But change gradually came about, and as I said, it wasn't all because of the goodwill of the non-Indigenous peoples. And one of the major changes, of course, was the 1967 referendum, where just over 90% of Australians voted to support the right for Aboriginal people to be counted in the census. And some people said, well, that was a kind of a recognition of citizenship rights. But an important consideration for us locals is that the electorate of Cowper, which was mentioned earlier, which is what we're in here now, had one of the highest, I think it was one of the top 2 or 3 highest no votes in the country. So we had a predominantly white Anglo-Saxon population here that still had these ingrained racist beliefs toward blackfellas. Other parts of Australia had been more open to post World War II migration, and so you had a wider influx of recognition of different cultures, which weren't all free of prejudice, but at least it gave a better breakdown of peoples, and so a likelihood of different beliefs and attitudes. But be that as it may, the carrying of the referendum led to some major reforms, and one of the largest reforms that had impact on us was the Whitlam government, which did away with that policy of assimilation and recognised that Aboriginal people should have the right to self-determination. Now, that only lasted for a short time in Australia as a government policy, because with the change of government back to the so-called Liberals, they decided to water down, we can't let the blackfellas have too much say in the matter. So we'll introduce a refined version and we'll call it self-management. So instead of you determining how you live and so on and so forth, we'll determine it for you, but we'll give you some of the tools to manage it. And that became the kind of major focus until we had the overturning to some degree of this concept of terra nullius. And that came about with the Marbay decision, 1992. And the outcome of that decision was the introduction of the Native Title Act. But prior to that, in 1983, the New South Wales government had introduced an Aboriginal Land Rights Act. And that Land Rights Act enabled the establishment in our local area of the Bunya Local Aboriginal Land Council at Warhope and Biripai Local Aboriginal Land Council here in Port. Now, that gave our people some access to land, but not much. The process under that New South Wales Aboriginal Land Rights Act was that Aboriginal communities could claim unwanted Crown land. Unwanted Crown land. And it's through a court process. And there are, not necessarily from this area, but there is a backlog of claims under that Act that go back into the early 1990s. So yeah, you can have some of your land back, but geez, you've got to wait for it, But it's not all bad. I hope you don't think that at least did enable us to have a kind of a focus for the Aboriginal community. The non-Aboriginal community, largely up to that point, because we had no reserve left here at Port Macquarie. Our families had been forced onto the reserves such as Purfleet Reserve at Taree or Burnbridge Mission over in Kempsey, or the Green Hills Mission at Kempsey as well. So we weren't a large visible Indigenous or First Nations population. So people were free to continue the way that they did. And they did. But that again began to change with the reconciliation process of the late 1990s, early 2000s, and the belief that, okay, things have been bad, let's bring people together and try and build a better future. But 20 years later, that hasn't yielded much. I mean, the Rudd government brought in a Closing the Gap program where it recognised, well, we should overcome the large discrepancies that exist between the Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people in all economic indicators. Length of life, infant mortality rates, income rates, incarceration rates, death in custody rates, and so on and so forth. That basically has been abandoned by our current government because it's too hard, they say. Yeah, we haven't made any progress on most of the indicators. So let's change what we're trying to do. Instead of identifying why it hasn't been achieved and setting about making those changes. Part of that reform should be led by the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of the Indigenous Peoples, because it recognises the rights for us as Indigenous people to determine our own cultures, our own way of being, and so on and so forth. Australia is a signatory to that, a reluctant signatory to that, but has not introduced any legislation to enact change through it. So it's a symbolic declaration in that sense. Yeah, thank you. But we're still here, our land's still here, the spirit of our land's still here. In some places it's been pushed down. So I believe that we've got an opportunity to rekindle the spirit, rekindle the land. People are beginning to think about things such as the bushfires, the floods, the impact of climate change. We've always said it as Goories people. That's part of us, it's part of our being. If we don't look after ourselves, we don't look after our country, we can expect problems. There are a number of places in Australia that are beginning to make change. You've got jurisdictions such as Victoria, Queensland, and even parts of the Northern Territory now that are beginning to talk about treaties. Now, my argument is that a treaty is the only way forward. There has never been a treaty signed in this country between First Nations peoples and non-Indigenous peoples, not one. And it all stems from Cook and his Terra Nullius fiction. A treaty recognises sovereign rights of people, of nation states, and it's enshrined in law, and it should be then enacted so that certain provisions are made, which can help address the injustice of the last 200 years. And that will help us move forward together as one. I don't believe that we can ever have reconciliation without justice. Now, I believe very much in my traditional law, my traditional culture, and that is that we are a caring and sharing peoples. That's half of the battle that we faced. Why we didn't have armies, why we didn't have wars, because we looked at bringing people in. We said, you can live with us if you abide by our law. Oxley down there didn't abide by the law. Them convicts going out there cutting down trees, going into areas where they probably shouldn't have gone, weren't abiding by laws. They weren't attacked and continually attacked. Think about it. This militia, His Majesty's regiments, they were carrying the old muskets. Most of the convict cedar parties, they don't have one or two muskets there between them. The white historical record notes that in some instances there was up to 60 Goories that they said were attacking them. Now, how silly would you have to be not to know that once an old mate fired his musket, you'd have a little bit of time before he reloaded to pick him off with a spear, especially if you outnumber him 60 to 1. But it just wasn't in our mentality. So if we achieved the outcome that we wanted, and that is the justice in that case, move them away from where they're not supposed to be, then we can get on with living with each other and get on living together. And that's what led to this thinking about treachery. They couldn't understand why blackfellas could be so pleasant one moment and so antagonistic the next. But in order to achieve these outcomes, we have to be honest. We have to look at the truth. We have to help tell the true story. As I continually say, none of us are responsible for what happened before we walked on this earth. None of us. But we're all responsible in some way for what's happened around us now and what can happen in the future. That's our responsibility. That's our law. It's looking after and learning from what happened in the past, the role of historians. Get the history, get the facts, the truth-telling, bring it out into the open, reflect on it, learn from it. What was done wrong? What can we do to improve things? Recognise that we are sovereign peoples. We may not be able to demonstrate our sovereignty or enjoy our sovereignty, but we have never ceded it. No blackfella in this country has ever signed a treaty. It cedes sovereignty to some degree. Okay? Recognise our sovereignty, get us some treaties, and then together we can walk as one. Not far from here tonight, there is a sound and light show called Wackalda. You'll notice I spell it different today, but that's me, stubborn old blackfella. I'm using Threlkeld spelling there, actually. Wakkal means one. Da, join with them means together as one. Okay? It's a brilliant exhibition. So make sure you catch it. I think I'm just about done. And to finish with, I've got what I've said, the dreaming continues. And I've got a quote from a good friend of mine, a recognised elder of the Ngema people, out Brewarren way, Paul Gordon. The quote, "Your life's journey is not just about you. It's about your ancestors, intergenerational. It's about your children, your children's children, your children's children, and so on." My thesis that I wrote for a doctorate that I did get was based on what I called the law, well, it's known as the law of the 7 generations, but I call my thesis in short the 7 generations. And I tracked 7 generations of my immediate family from my convict ancestor and Charlotte, his Goorie wife, Birpai wife, and followed that line through. The 6, they had 8 kids, 6 of them had children of their own, so I've made reference to all of those lines of the family. Incredible history, incredible stories. One of their children, you've all heard something about, is Mary Ann Boat, the wife of Thunderbolt. I'm descended directly from her second oldest, younger brother, William Bug. And he married another Biripai Goorie, whose name was Emily Graham, but she again was Southern Biripai. But that Bug family history, just in my own family, that Bug family history, shows not only the beginning, the relationship between the convict and the Goorie, but a number of the branches of the family are descendants of other convicts and Goories. And one of the convicts, at least one of them, that I was able to recognise was from Port Macquarie. Not from the original group, but his name is Henry Yarnold. And some of our family, the Yarnold family, are descended from him. Interesting, his story is different to my third great-grandfather's because he never married his Goorie wife, who was only ever known as Maria, Aboriginal. He had two white wives and had family from them, but I'm not sure that they'll ever want to know their black relatives. And there's endless stories about that. What happened, and Clive's working on the convicts' story, the original convicts, and I've said to Clive, how many of them stayed in Port Macquarie? Because what we often forget is that with the number of convicts that came to New South Wales, there was something like 80% of them, or certainly 75% of them were male. There was always going to be problems with heterosexual white males and not enough females. It led to such problems that Governor Gibbs brought in a proclamation in 1836, forbidding the intermarriage or the interrelationship between convicts predominantly and Aboriginal women. And it nearly led to the demise of the Australian Agricultural Company, which was the largest capitalist venture in the colony at the time, because he threatened to withdraw convict labour from any district where it was proven that there was cohabitation going on, which was a challenge because they'd already recognised that James Bug had 2 kids to a Goorie woman. So they took those kids away. So in my family, we've got evidence of that stolen generations as far back as then. They were taken to the orphan schools in Sydney. Cohabitation continued to bedevil my family. My great-grandmothers and my grandma, who was about 21 at the time, and her elder sister Mary, they were involved in a court case here in Port Macquarie where charges were laid against 3 or 4 white men for visiting the blackfellas camp. And at that time, great-grandma and them, they were living out towards the racecourse. That's 1922. So that's the history of, part of my family's history, but part of the history of Port Macquarie. We didn't disappear. We're not just by-products of the history of this place. And I just hope that I've provided something that might get you and others to reflect on how we can best go forward in the future. So thank you.
Thank you very much, John, for that perspective. And I invite any questions from the floor.
as you were talking, I got wondering about that process of giving breastplates to people. Now, in one sense, it's a really demeaning act. But I wonder also whether it can be interpreted, potentially, as an act of recognising sovereignty. In the sense that what you're doing is that you're making a bargain with people. You're recognising that that person has ownership of the country, in which, and that the implicit bargain is that if you round up convicts for us, then we're going to recognise your authority. So there's a recognition of authority in there, which I think is actually quite interesting. Has anybody tried testing that?
Not that I'm aware of, but it's an interesting thought. And particularly so because they were generally inscribed as king.
King, yeah, I was about to say.
And,
The designation of king seems to tie in with that.
So,
Even though it's an odd title, isn't it?
well, it was one that they bestowed, and they picked out, who they thought was worthy. And for some people, I guess we believe that they're somewhat insignificant, King Jackie or King Billy or whatever. But interestingly, Uncle Charlie Murray, who one of my fellows in the Thomas Dick photographic collections, he was married to my great grandmother's sister, and he was often called King Murray. So, and I don't know if he ever was given a breastplate, but certainly the Bunya Local Aboriginal Land Council has got a breastplate that was presented in the early 1900s to a fellow who was named, a Goorie fellow that was known as Bunya Jimmy. So he was King Bunya Jimmy. And another sideline there is the breastplate was presented by Duncan Bain. And Duncan Bain was one of the large white property owners, the first major white property owner that Warhope. And he's another one that had 2 wives and several white kids, but I've recently made connection with his black descendants.
That's in talking about these really fundamentally important issues of invasion and reconciliation, what we've still got here essentially is family history. We're all engaged in the same endeavour, in one way or another, and that seems a neat point to end with, that we're all working on the same
Reconciliation.
Yes, indeed. But thank you so much, John, for finishing today.